We are very pleased and privileged to have Dr. Catherine Schenecker with us today. Kate has been studying the ecology of ungulates for over 25 years as a research wildlife biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey in Fort Collins, Colorado. She received her master's degree from the University of Arizona, where she studied bighorn sheep, and a PhD from Colorado State studying bison and elk grazing ecology in the Great Sand Dunes of southern Colorado. She's currently the leader of the Ungulate Ecology Research Group and focuses her efforts on science that support bison conservation and wild horse and burro research across the West. We are really happy to have her here. She'll be talking about domestication, which I would argue is really the linchpin of this entire debate about free-roaming horses and burros on our rangelands. And with that, Kate, please take it away.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for inviting me. So I'm Kate Schenecker. I'm going to show you some slides where there are other people have contributed, and I'll be naming them at that time to thank them for being part of this work. Okay, so what I'm going to do is start off by just talking a little bit about the history of Equidae in North America, and then we'll go into a little bit about domestication and what are the traits of domestication. We'll talk about fertilization. And then I'm going to present some empirical evidence that we collected on free-roaming equids in Utah and Arizona. And then we're going to ask the question, well, does it matter? Does this matter at all? And then hopefully we will have a lively discussion, as is usually the case when horses are the topic. So to start off with, just backing up a long time, horses really were very, very prevalent. They evolved in North America and they radiated through the Bering Land Bridge between North America and Asia. And there were very many multiple extinctions and repopulations in North America for 2 to 3 million years. They really went back and forth. And, if they went extinct, then they'd recolonate from Asia. They went extinct in North America, then they'd recolonate and so forth. So they really went back and forth along with many other species. There were, at the height, about 27 species of equids that occurred during the Pleistocene in North America. They had among the highest radiation of all of the species in North America were the equids, but they went extinct during the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. And it's thought that had to do with rapid and variable climate change, grassland contraction, or competition with ruminants. For carnivores, it maybe was due to loss of prey or perhaps overhunting. But this time also kind of gave rise to the modern species. So we had this transition from Pleistocene to Holocene, and the equids didn't survive it, but bison did, and cervids did, and some other species did. Many species actually did survive this transition. They were mostly the ruminants. So the Equidae species, although they were no longer in North America, they continued to evolve in Asia. And about 5,500 or 6,000 years before present in Kazakhstan, they are thought to have been domesticated. They were primarily domesticated for milk and meat. There was ancient DNA from horses discovered in ancient potsherds. That's how they discovered the milk aspect of it. And pretty much then and now, horse distribution really tracked the distribution of humans. So people brought them places. They were transported to the New World in 1493 on the second expedition of Christopher Columbus. At least those are the records that are in the cargo ship logs, the Queen's Manifest from that time. And so that's how they got to the New World, really Mexico, and then moved up to North America after that, or up through North America. So since that time, horses have really been an integral part of human cultures for multiple centuries. They were integral to tribal hunting and warfare. They pulled wagons out west. They were important for agriculture. And they were used heavily in warfare up, through even World War I. So horses are very beloved. They've been around, and this really helps explain this close relationship that humans have with horses. So let's talk about domestication a little bit. The definition of domestication is the specific selection for tameness. Horses and burros were domesticated, roughly 5,000 years ago. This diagram shows you about the time that different species were domesticated, and dogs were really the first. Dogs from wolves were the first species that was really domesticated by humans. One thing that's important about domestication is it does alter the behavior, physiology, and morphology of the domesticates relative to their wild ancestors. There is lots of evidence for enhanced reproduction and higher survival of domesticates. The natural selection pressures are relaxed, so they become less responsive to environmental feedbacks. That does make sense because the changes that come from domestication are a result of being protected and fed by humans receiving that consistent husbandry. So they no longer have to respond to environmental cues because their survival is kind of guaranteed. They're being fed and protected from the elements. The thing about domestication is it does not produce greater genetic variation. If anything, it limits their genetic variability. It also results in other non-intended traits, or I should say non-selected for traits. So some of the traits that are affected by domestication, I said it's the onset of unintended physical attributes. What this really means is when you're selecting for a suite of genes, other things come along with it that you didn't select for, but they show up, such as curly hair, you can see the cat, a curled tail, floppy ears, and coat color variations. These are just genes that coincided with the selection for domestication, and then they express themselves. There's also brain size reductions and cranial modulation. You can see the pug there. The wolf is on the left, and then the pug skull is on the right. You can see that change. And then there's also genetic changes that are measurable. There's some newer papers that have come out recently that are demonstrating some of the genetic changes that occur. And then there are behavioral adaptations that happen as well, such as reduced vigilance to predation, because if you're always being protected, that kind of makes sense that you wouldn't need to be as wary. And one of the things that I'm going to focus on a lot today and talk about is this age of first reproduction and the reproductive rate of domesticated species. So fertilization, let's talk about that. So first, feral is not a slur. The word feral is not a slur. It is actually a biological term that is defined as a free-roaming or a wild descendant of a domesticated species. And one of the most important things to note that is, being uncovered, I guess, is that feral species broadly maintain numerous traits associated with and that were induced by domestication. Fertilization does not return a species to its wild phenotype. There's a really interesting paper, Are Fertilization and Domestication Mirror Processes? That's a great read. It goes through and demonstrates, or at least investigates, multiple traits to see, do these things turn back to a wild animal, completely wild in all the aspects of being wild, and reverse domestication. Can domestication be reversed? And one of the reasons that is really so challenging is that the genetic pool is limited for the domesticated or feral species because they underwent artificial selection by humans, which removed some of the genetics and selected for certain genes, but not for other genes. So there is limited genetic material now for new structural or trait adaptations. So these concepts of domestication and fertilization are very relevant to horses and burros. The issue, though, is that in many cases, feral species, there's an effort to eradicate them. Not with feral cats everywhere and not with some species, but sometimes there is an effort to eliminate or eradicate feral species. That is not the case for horses and burros. Because horses and burros on BLM and Forest Service lands, they are federally protected. And they are protected because it was a societal decision based on their value, their cultural history, and their esteem to society. So this was a societal decision to protect this animal. And it's also important to note that all wildlife needs to be managed, no matter what species. We are in the age of everything is monitored and managed. So how did domestication affect horses and burros? So the artificial selection for Equidae really concentrated on milk and meat production, as I mentioned. So they really were selecting for high reproductive output because you want to have lots of babies if you want the meat. Just like, when we domesticate a species, we want high productivity. Phenotype and morphology, that was for strength for riding and for carrying loads, particularly for burros, considered more beasts of burden. And then also they were selected for amenability and ease of training. And the result of that was that domesticated horses have a brain size 16% smaller due to the reduced stimulation of being protected and fed. They have very high variation in coat colors due to allelic diversity of genes that coincided with domestication. And they also have high fecundity and very high productivity for human uses because that's what was originally selected for. So I want to talk to you a little bit about a project that I did with Dr. Sarah King at CSU, where we assessed the demography of free-roaming populations of horses and burros. We basically radio collared and we checked 4 populations and we monitored them for 4 years. We had 30 collars in each population. And we also had each population start at 100 individuals so that we could control for, none of the populations were way over capacity or anything, to make sure that growth rate potential was the same. So each population started at 100 individuals with the equal sex ratio. And the horses were located every 2 weeks by our field crew during the breeding season and every 4 weeks in the winter. And during those times, we measured foaling rate. All the mares were watched to find out when they foal. And then we recorded who their foal was and their survival. So we recorded survival of those animals and everyone in the population, age of first foaling. And with these and other attributes, we were able to calculate a population growth rate for each of the populations over those 4 years. So the areas that we studied in were the Conger and Frisco herd management areas in Utah. Those are both wild horse herds. And then we also did this in the Sinbad and Lake Pleasant herds, which are burro populations. And these are all BLM animals and BLM herd management areas. So we ended up with 4 years of demographic data in each population between 2015 and 2020. So let's get right into results. So one of the things that's implicated in domestication is the age of first foaling. So when we looked at our data, I'm showing you that the very top row is Conger horses on the right side, and you can see Conger, and then the second row is Frisco. Then we have Lake Pleasant burros and then Sinbad burros on the bottom. So in the very top row, you can see in Conger, the age of first foaling, if you look at the 2-year-olds, so this is the age of the mother in years, and they're the 2-year-olds, which is what I have the arrows pointing to, there were more 2-year-olds giving birth in Conger. This is the average over 4 years than 4-year-olds. And they're just below 3-year-olds. And there were more 2-year-olds giving birth, meaning they were bred as yearlings, than 6 years old and 7 and so on. And then if we go down a row and you look at Frisco, you can see that the 2-year-olds were on par with 3-year-olds. So the same number of 2-year-olds gave birth as 3-year-olds. It was a little bit less when we go down another row for Lake Pleasant and Sinbad. It looks like the burros really have their first foal at age 3 instead of being bred as yearlings and having their first foal at age 2. This information is actually consistent with a paper that was written by Lisa Grant, where they reported 58% pregnancy rate in 2-year-old horses. So I think that probably there may be more incidences. We always used to think that, yearlings aren't being bred, but in this case, at least over 50% of them were in the Grant paper. Okay, so let's take a look at the foaling rate. I've split this out between mares that are 2 years and older, 3 years and older, and 4 years and older. So if we look at this by year, and all of these data are only from Conger because we were not able to collect foaling rates at Frisco. So these numbers represent productivity. So foaling rate. This in 2017, there were in Conger there were 62 foals per 100 mares when you start at age 2. If you look at the average at the bottom of 2-year-olds, mares that are 2 years old and older, the average foaling rate is 66 foals per 100 mares. For 3-year-old, the average was 71 foals per 100 mares. And then the 4-year-olds was 74 foals per 100 mares. And you can see that it varied through the years. If you look up and down those columns, even as high as 82 foals per 100 mares in some time, and then 72 foals per 100 mares, which included the 2-year-olds. So these are high productivity numbers. And but the question is, do these foals survive? So when we look at survival, we can see that population survival is very, very high. So in 2016, we have Conger on the left, and then Frisco on the right. They're the two different populations. If you look at all of those numbers, 99% survival, 96%, 98, 99, 98. The average for Conger over the 4-year period that we were studying them was a 98% survival rate. So high fecundity and pretty high survival. And we saw a very similar situation in Frisco with high survival of the population each year, and then a 97% average over the 4 years. So this leads us to our growth rate. Well, what does this all mean for the growth rate of the population? In Conger on the left, you can see the growth rate each year because it's in each row, 2016, 17, 18. So you can see that, and then the average at the bottom is 1.25. That means that population is growing at 25% a year. In 4 years, that Conger herd would double if it had no management in 4 years. And in Frisco, it's a little bit shy of that, but similarly, very high growth rates over the 4-year period. So what does this actually mean? So if we look at reproductive traits of our feral animals versus some of the wild non-domesticated equids, we know that feral equids we have data to show that they're foaling when they're 2 or 3 years old. So the horses often foal when they're 2 years old, and the burros at 3 years old. Non-domesticated equids really have their first foal when they're 4 to 6 years old. Feral equids foal every year or every 3 of 4 years. But non-domesticated equids, or the wild native equids in Africa, this includes Przewalski's horses in the wild as well, they foal every other year at most. Feral equids have really high survival across all age classes, and non-domesticated equids have high foal juvenile mortality because of predation, primarily because of predation, but even without predation in areas where there aren't a lot of predators, they still have higher juvenile mortality. Well, this leads us to feral equids having very high population growth rates, and then non-domesticated equids having moderate to low population growth rates. So the main question is, does it matter? And I guess from the human social perspective, the fact that horses are protected, no, it really doesn't matter. We as a society decided that these species are important. They're culturally valued and high esteemed to humans, and so our society as a whole decided to protect them. And it happened through Congress, and Congress passed a law in 1971 protecting the horses that were found on BLM and Forest Service lands. Because horses and burros are valued and protected, it was really a social decision, so it doesn't really matter from that perspective. But there does need to be a recognition that this high fecundity is a real phenomena. From the biological and management perspective, yeah, it's very important. It's very important to understand what's going on. The first rule of wildlife management is to know your species. And we need to be able to project growth or decline of species to know what's happening with a population. And it's also important for wildlife managers, state agencies, and rangeland managers so that they can understand what's going on and how the growth potential of these populations. The thing is, horse populations grow faster because of their biology, and managing them, therefore, is very, very challenging. In essence, it requires more intense management to retain those target population size, which is socially unpopular. And therein is the conundrum, that it's that the public does not like managing horses, but it is required by their biology. So also some of the other things that we're learning more about recently that are relative to other wildlife is that horses do compete with wildlife at water sources. We know from the Elstrom and Kelm work that horses cause 76% reduction in water visits by bighorn sheep. Gooch demonstrated that horses dominated water sources and prevented pronghorn from approaching, and Perry et al. Recorded, you can see the photos there, recorded horses actively pushing elk away from a water source. That's important in the West because water, of course, is a limiting resource. Overabundant horses also affect sage grouse. That was demonstrated in the Coates et al. Paper. And then Beck et al. Recently looked at sage grouse at different life stages, so that if chicks are not affected, or if chicks are affected, and let's say a chick survives and it goes to the next stage, it may not be affected there, but then it can also be affected at the next stage. So he really looked at, this paper anyway, really looked at the compounding that can happen because it's affecting these sage grouse at different life stages. So if they survive one, they may actually have negative consequences later in the face of overabundant horses. So overabundance of horses does affect other species. We also know that managers really struggle to control population sizes in most populations. The graphics on the right show you with the blue arrow, that is when the last time that managers were able to bring the population size down to AML, which is the target population size in yellow there. And burros also, and they did a lot of removals, I guess, in 2007, but that really, after that, the population has just gotten higher and higher. So horses and burros, but particularly horses, are very, they're hard to manage. It also seems like they may not fit the same density dependent model for other North American ungulates due to their history of domestication. The Grange paper goes through this very, very aptly, and demonstrates that there may be some things that are different about the domesticated horses in which they put reproduction ahead of their own survival. And lastly, I would just say that self-limitation is ugly. I mean, these horses are not in bad condition, but horses end up often in a lot of areas that are not really great for a large-bodied grazing species. So, in conclusion, I would just say that we should probably expect management to be intense because of the high growth due to early onset of foaling, high fecundity of individual mares, and this very high survival that they have. As such, resource managers really cannot rely on density dependence to help limit populations like it can for other ungulates. And we may need to more carefully consider their special status of being domesticated or feral in their management. And perhaps we should be working harder to figure out how overabundance of horses affects other inhabitants, because there are a lot of species that are relying on public rangelands. With that, I would like to thank Sarah King and Mary Cole, all the amazing field technicians who helped us collect data. Thank you to the Bureau of Land Management for the logistical support. And we received funding from BLM, the USGS Fort Collins Science Center, and Colorado State University.